in the beginning of the webinar, as he's traveling, we are going ahead with the proceeding of the webinar and we'll try to connect with the President sir in later. Dr. HRP Yadav, SDG is also unable to join with us due to a sudden unavoidable engagements. Now may I invite Engineer Ashwani Kumar Saxena, Chairman BOG SDF, for his address, followed by his brief introduction to the August gathering. Engineer Ashwani Kumar Saxena has 47 years of professional experience. He worked with Mekon Limited for 36 years, also worked as Executive Director Project at Bhushan Power and Steel Limited. Currently serving with his professional expertise as Director with private companies and as Independent Director for foreign countries. May I now request Chairman BOG SDF, Engineer Ashwani Kumar Saxena, sir, for his address. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Dipesh. Can you see my slide or not? Hello?
Not yet, sir.
Now you are a presenter. Please show your screen, sir.
It is. Can you see now?
Yes, sir. We can see now.
Okay,
yes,
fine.
sir.
Thank you, Dipesh, for your kind words. And it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Eric Dushman, Senior Policy Researchers, IGES, Japan, Ms. Vaistha Vijayanaike, Executive Director, Silcan Trust, Sri Lanka, Dr. Lida Pet, Hatfield Consultant, Indonesia, and Dr. Pooja Sahani, who is consultant with ERDMP Academy and will be the moderator for the program, and my very, very own and dear one, Sunil Grover, without whose help none of our programs would have been successful. And this is our 13th webinar on SDGs, 1-3. In the series of SDGs, we are 13th today, and I think we are taking a break for next 3-4 weeks before we come back on continue on the series. And Dr. Rakesh will join us a little later. He is already in a meeting or something related to this SDG, and which perhaps we may be having a program very soon, some very important program. No, my screen, my slides, I cannot see myself, but let me see if I can, I don't know how to move forward, Devraji. I'm unable to move forward.
Please run that slideshow. Then it will be on a full screen and you will be able to continue with the slides.
No, I am on the slideshow, but I have to go on full screen. So let me see, I'll try. Okay, I'll do it from here. Fine. I don't think I'm going on the full screen. Well, oceans cover 3/4 of the Earth's surface and contain 97% of Earth's water and represent 99% of the living space on the planet by volume. Globally, the market value, the coastal resources and industries estimated as $3 trillion per year, or about 5% of global GDP. And globally, the levels of capture fisheries are nearly ocean's productive capacity, and maybe just about, and with catches on the order of about 80 million tons. Well, they also absorb about 30% of the carbon dioxide produced by humans and serve as the world's largest source of protein, and marine fisheries directly or indirectly employ over 200 million people. And the subsidies which are being provided for fishing are contributing the rapid depletion of many fish species. As much as 40% of the world's oceans are heavily affected by human activities, including pollution, depleted fisheries, and loss of coastal habitats. And there are about some 120 species of marine mammal to be found in the world. A fourth of these may be found in India and in surrounding places. India itself has a coastline of 7,615 kilometers, and it has about 2,000 traditional fish landing centers, and the freshwater resources consist of 195,000, slightly more than that, kilometers of rivers and canals, 2.9 million hectares of minor and major reservoirs, and 2.4 million hectares of ponds and lakes, and about zero point 0.8 million hectares of floodplain, wetlands, and water bodies. Fishing in India is a major industry, employing about 14.5 million people, and it ranks second in aquaculture. If you're going by train on the east coast, you will find plenty of aquaculture farms both in Orissa and Andhra and down south. And the fisheries, some people say we are second, some people say we are third. So even if we take third, the fisheries contribute about 1.07% of the total GDP. According to the National Fisheries Development Board, the fisheries industries generates about export earnings of rupees 334 billion. Centrally sponsored schemes will increase exports by rupees 1 lakh crore by 2025, and 65,000 fishermen have been trained under these schemes since 2017 to 2020, and freshwater consists 55% of total production. Well, even in the state of Jharkhand, where I'm living now, the fisheries are catching up. There's not much of development. Wherever you go, you can find a small fish farm and small rivulets as well. As far as maritime industry is concerned, we are the 16th largest maritime country in the world. We have 12 major ports, 6 on the east coast and 6 on the western coast, and 200 non-major ports, and which are under jurisdiction of the respective state governments. Ports in India handle about 95% of trade volumes in India. Solid cargo contributes the largest share of all traffic handled at major ports in India, and followed by liquid cargo and containers. Well, 64% of the ocean is not part of any jurisdiction of any country. They are high seas and so vulnerable to overfishing and habitat destruction. 50% of Earth's oxygen is provided by the ocean's phytoplankton. And if you have a marine reserve, which in India we have 6 numbers of marine reserves, starting from Gujarat, right, coming from Arabian Sea to the Bay of Bengal. We have 6 marine reserves, and if in the marine reserves, your 1,000% is how much marine life can grow in mass when protected in marine reserves. Well, I have been to some of the offshore installations and intake structures, and the drivers have to go inside to clean the pipes. Maybe you're in the nuclear power plants located on the coasts. Well, the oceans provide a lot of very natural resources. Fish, we already know that the oceans have been fished for thousands of years, an integral part of human society. Fish have been important to the world economy, and fisheries today provide about 16% of total protein, with higher percentage occurring in developing nations. Well, shipping is another area where you have a lot of 11 billion tons of cargo is shipped across the world, and the routes you can see, and these are carried by 57,000 merchant ships. And leave aside the naval ships are around 3,350, but the major is taken care by 57,000 merchant ships carrying 11 billion tons of material from. But tourism is another which is picking up. Cruise tourism. Well, we have 314 cruise ships running all over the world, and India is nowhere behind. We have started cruise from Bombay to Goa, and there are other also places where cruise tourism is coming into play. Then coming to mining, this was one of the main interests or which I was trying to work out in 1984, polymetallic nodules, mining of polymetallic nodules and sands and gravels. And here you can see the resources of the polymetallic nodules spread over the entire world. Well, we in India, we were looking at this deposit somewhere here, which was National Institute of Oceanography was working on it along with IIT Chennai or Madras Ocean Engineering Center, where they were trying to find out the places where we can have get these polymetallic nodules, because they are a source of heavy metals, cadmium, nickel, cobalt, and all those things. Coming to another thing is oil. Well, oil is another major source, oil and gas, and there are a number of platforms offshore. And this map, you can see the offshore destinations of where you can get oil. Well, this is a source of energy for most of us, and we in India depended highly on the Bombay oil and as well as the East Coast where the oil discoveries have taken place, and some part of oil somewhere near Gujarat as well. Coming to SDGs, well, there are 17 goals which have been set. Goal number 1 to 6 are social SDGs, 7 to 12 are economic SDGs, 13, 14, 15 are environmental SDGs. And the means of implementation are SDG 16 and 17. Well, we got talking on the environment-related SDGs, and these are the targets. They are the, you can say, 10 targets, which have each one has got one indicator, and there are 7 targets which are outcome targets, and your 14A, B, C are the means how to sustain, get the means to achieve the targets of 1 to 7, 14.1 to 14.7. Well, there are a lot of synergies between the Sustainable Development Goal 14 and other SDGs like SDG 1, poverty, SDG 2, hunger, SDG 8, economic growth, SDG 10, reduce inequalities, 12, responsible consumption and production, and 13, climate change. Well, all these are interrelated, as all SDGs are interrelated. So 14 is interrelated with these, majorly with these, and with others as well. If you look at India, we have already seen in different formats. 13.36 population lives in the coastal districts, and we are ranked 12. Negative point is that we are ranked 12 of the 20 countries responsible for marine pollution. And we are generating plastics, 40%, second largest producer of fish, and sea level is rising by 1.33 millimeter per year on the coastline, which is going to have a very bad effect, especially in the coastal regions. Coming to marine pollution, pollution is through thermal, plastics, impurities, sewage, littering, and trash. If you go on YouTube and go on the marine pollution, just type marine pollution, you will get some very beautiful videos on marine pollution. Well, inland, 80% of all marine pollution comes from land-based activities. And these land-based activities you can sum up as urban rubbish or industrial waste, agro-business waste, chemical toxic components coming every day where people are putting in waste, and the garbage which finds its place in the into the sea through the rivers and rivulets. And you can see how people are just dumping in the garbage or the outfall system. No proper designed marine outfall systems. They are one or two, like Zuari in Goa, they have marine outfall systems. But normally people or the industries do not bother to go in for a proper designed marine outfall system. Well, the impacts are a huge range of diseases. You can see the color and the smell of water, death of aquatic animals, water pollution, and destruction of ecosystems. Well, this is what you can see at points, several places. And in fact, on the WhatsApp messages, once you get, sometimes you feel so disturbed when you see that the plastic in the nose of tortoise and people trying to help it out, or some pelicans, or some even been doused with oil, which is their oil spills. Well, direct discharge, as I said, you can see many direct discharges which are there. And then ships and oil spills, they are having a lot of devastating effects while being toxic to marine life. And discharge of cargo, of course, now you cannot discharge the hull or the water into your zone area, that is 20 kilometers within your land boundary, or from the low tide level, extended into maybe 12 nautical miles. You cannot discharge even the water in that is as per the latest laws. But still, people, we have problems, and discharge of cargo residues, then bulk carriers, they pollute. And it has been estimated that container ships lose over nearly 10,000 containers at sea each year, usually during storms. And the ships also create noise, which is again a problem for the aquatic life. Then the oceans or seas, they are the sinks for the carbon sinks. And because of this increasing CO2 levels, there is sort of you can say acidification of going on of the sea. Structures which are made of calcium carbonate, that is corals and others, they may become vulnerable to dissolution and affecting corals or about the shell fish to form shells. This is another aspect. Then debris, the plastic bags and your holders for the 6-pack cups, rings, which hold your cups and other things, bottles, they, along with the fishing nets and the plastic debris, they are a very big source of nuisance or pollution in the seas. And then pesticides, which come, and herbicides which come from the agriculture fields, they are again cause of major pollution for the aquatic life, disturbing them. And then we have the toxic metals, mercury, lead, and cadmium coming from batteries, sewage, fuel, and other things which are again a great problem for your aquatic life. The thermal pollution from industries or high temperature, not only in the seas, you can find the water discharges in the rivers, which causes thermal pollution and has effect on the aquatic life. Then radioactive waste, usually byproducts of nuclear power generation, or even weapon testing, liquid waste discharged from cooling water of nuclear reactors. These are all sorts of radioactive pollution. And underwater noise, that is from your various movements, and between 50 and 75 ambient noise in the ocean increased. Also, that is again a problem which is affecting the life of your aquatic life. Then we have coming to little futuristic. We have the blue economy. Well, we all, as the time comes later on, where this SDG 14 has a major role to play, is that time will come when each country will try to harness the economy from the seas. And here you can see how much is the size of blue economy. Australia, 3.6% of GDP, 17 billion US dollars, Canada 15.98, and of the like UK is 84.27, and United States is 138, and China, leader of the pack, is 239.09 US billion dollars. And so you can see the time has come when we have to look into the SDG 14, how to we implement. And I'm sure with our very learned speakers coming in today, we will be highly, we'll carry back a lot of we'll go back educated and much more knowledgeable. And if you see how long does it take that this whatever pollutants are there in the sea, disposable diapers 450 years, plastic bottles 450 years, fishing lines 600 years, and there's so many. Nothing is less than there are there are so many things starting from a few years to hundreds and hundreds of years. How to get over it? And another suffocated spots along the coastal line. We call it dead zones. About 40 years ago, or maybe 45 years ago, there were hardly 20 or 30 dead zones. Today, there are more than 400 dead zones, including in India or in Asia. You can see the number of dead zones, wherein because of eutrophication and other things, the marine life is getting affected. Some thoughts, we must plan disposal of waste through marine outfall systems, reduction in use of chemicals and pesticides, herbicides, prudent way of fishing, and not throwing rubbish in waters, use water wisely, and government puts a strict laws that help minimize water pollution. And of course, we have to look into sustainable development, integrated management, eco-based management, good governance, adaptive management and best practices, and the precautionary approach, the preservation of marine biodiversity, protecting vulnerable ocean habits, and marine protected areas, and national marine sanctuaries, World Heritage marine sites should be increased, in my opinion. And we in India, we have 6. Maybe in time to come, we will go into double digit very soon. And with this, I thank you all very much for listening to me. And I look forward to the talks from my very, very learned speakers from Japan, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka.
For the proceedings. Dr. Pooja, over to you. Hello.
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry, I was talking to one of the panelists who was having problems. So I was just speaking to her. So thank you very much. And I would like to welcome everyone to this really interesting webinar today on life below water. And without much ado, I would now like to introduce our panelists. And it gives me really great pleasure to introduce Dr. Eric Zussman, who is a former colleague of mine from the Institute of Global Environmental Strategies based in Japan. I'll briefly be reading out on Eric's CV. I'll keep it very, very short. So Eric is a senior policy researcher and area leader at the Institute of Global Environmental Strategies in Hayama, Japan. And Eric holds a bachelor's degree interestingly, in Chinese, not Japanese. He lives in Japan, but he holds a PhD in a degree in Chinese from Rutgers University, and a dual master's in public policy and Asian studies from the University of Texas in Austin. And he holds a PhD in political science from the University of California, Los Angeles. And for nearly the last 2 decades, Eric has been conducting research on various environmental issues in Asia. And this has included working on China's Yellow Sea Commission, the Chinese Research Academy on Environmental Science, and a lot more. And currently, Eric serves as the lead author of the 6th assessment on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So I'll stop there, and I'll now request Eric to go ahead with this presentation. Floor is yours, Eric.
Okay, thank you so much, Pooja, and thank you so much, Dr. Saxena, for a very useful introductory presentation. I'd like to share my screen so I can.
Okay, we can see it.
Perfect. Okay.
Yes, but this is the middle of the presentation, I think.
Yeah, I like to build up a little bit of suspense. Okay, so my presentation is called Strengthening National Responses to SDG 14. And I'm going to focus a lot on a project that we did with the Asian Development Bank that was looking at how countries could implement, quote unquote, the environmental dimensions of the SDGs. This included SDG 14, SDG 15, as well as SDG 12 and several other targets under other SDGs that have an environmental focus. And I'll roughly break up my presentation into 4 different parts. So the first part will give a little bit of background and also offer some key questions that I hope to address. The second part will look at some of the key findings from it'll take a look at the way that we approach these questions. Sorry. And then the third part will give us some findings. And then last, I want to touch a little bit on the impacts of COVID on the SDGs, not just SDG 14, but all of the SDGs and this triple R framework that we're working on at our institute that will hopefully help get us back on course with the SDGs. So first of all, I think it's useful to help put this question of how we're doing on the SDGs in context. And for those of you who have been following the process, actually, this is a well-timed webinar because it falls right in the middle of the Asia Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development. This is the APFSD, and it's the regional meeting where we assess how we're doing on the SDGs and hear how countries are doing. And unfortunately, when it comes to SDG 14, this is the most recent data, we're not doing so great. So you can actually see from this chart that is filling up most of the right hand of my screen, SDG 14 along with SDG 13 on climate action, our 2 SDGs were not only having insufficient progress, but we're actually experiencing regression. And that's indicated by the red color of this bar. Moreover, when we look at the specific targets under the SDG 14, there's 10 targets, as Dr. Saxena mentioned. For one of these targets, we have enough data to say that we're going in the right direction, but we're going too slow. That's conservation of coastal areas. And then we have enough data for 2 other targets to suggest that we're regressing. This is marine pollution and marine resources for island development. Meanwhile, for the other 7 targets, we do not have enough data to make a qualified assessment at the regional level. So this will give us some important background, and it also gets us to some of the main questions we addressed through this ADB project on the environmental dimensions of the SDGs. That project really tried to answer 4 questions. The first question is, which of select environmental related SDGs and targets are priorities for countries in the Asia Pacific? What kinds of activities and projects have countries initiated to address these priorities? What are the main issues, challenges, and barriers to leveraging the SDGs to address these priorities and issues? And how can the development and environmental communities help overcome some of these challenges and barriers? Okay, so in order to answer these questions, I mean, one of the nice things about working with the ADB is they have sufficient amount of resources and staff to really dive in deep to some of these questions. And so what we did is we had a team of researchers that were doing interviews in 14 different countries in Asia Pacific. And those countries are listed at the bottom here. We try to have a good assortment of countries from different development levels, as well as different regions, as well as different geographic backgrounds. And in order to look at the situation in each of these countries, we did 2 rounds of desk study, which was used to sort of scope out what the general situation was in the countries. We did that with like a 3-page summary on SDG 12, 14, 15. And then we did a deeper dive where we expanded that out to about 20 pages. And then the sort of thing that really helped crystallize some of the answers to these questions were a series of semi-structured interviews where we talked to ministries of environment, finance, foreign affairs, in some cases, ministries of forestry and agriculture, to really understand what was happening when it came to these SDGs. And also, we then tried to validate some of our findings with a workshop that was attended by over 120 policymakers in Asia Pacific from these 14 different countries, as well as a few other countries. Okay, so some of the key findings that we arrived at. So first of all, we did find in the good side of things that awareness of the environmental related SDGs is quite high. In terms of the number of countries, so 12 out of the 14 countries that were surveyed on average suggested that they have a good awareness or high levels of awareness of these SDGs, whereas only 2 countries, the awareness was at the medium level. So this was quite a nice finding. And then there's also very concrete examples that reflect this awareness. So I'm just highlighting one example actually that our Institute IGES has worked on in collaboration with the Ministry of Environment in Japan. And this is installing advanced wastewater treatment technology in a fish processing factory in Jembrana, Indonesia. This is in the western part of Bali. And to sort of overlap with some of the points raised previously and to foreshadow some of the points I'll raise subsequently, this type of wastewater treatment technology, I mean, it came from Japan, but it has one of the added benefits is it takes some of the trapped methane from the wastewater treatment and uses it to generate biogas. So it achieves what we call in the climate change community achieves co-benefits, both reducing environmental pollution that would be discharged out into the water, as well as reducing greenhouse gases, in this case, methane, and doing so in a way that's relatively energy efficient. So there are a lot of examples actually at the project level, especially that reflect this awareness of this SDG and reflect an integrated understanding of the SDGs, once again at the project level. But when it comes to reflecting this in policies, these interlinkages between different SDG targets and across the SDGs themselves are not as much of a priority. So Here I'm giving you a graph of all of the different targets and the percentage of countries that indicated that these targets were a priority for SDG 14. And what you could see here is a quite uneven pattern. And of course, I mean, the national context is going to determine quite a bit, but in general, what we would anticipate is if countries were taking a more integrated approach to these issues, you would see that most of the targets would be a priority, or at least the targets would be a priority at relatively the same level, but that's clearly not the case here. And just to give some sense of why we think this is happening, so what we found a lot of times in talking to policymakers is that the SDGs in some ways have reinforced efforts to work on issues that different ministries were already working on. But when it came to making linkages across different issues, or when it came to trying to tackle newer issues, especially more upstream approaches to, for instance, controlling pollution, that was more challenging. And the SDGs, in some ways, that aspirational vision that underpins the SDGs is not really being taken to heart, especially when it comes to the policy level. But the good thing that we did find, though, so this is sort of a good news, bad news story, is that when it comes to sort of more of these conventional environmental issues, these tend to be a greater priority. So this target, this diagram right here is showing the priorities for many of the other quote unquote environmentally related SDGs. And here you can see a little bit more of an even pattern with higher levels of priority given to these targets. So one of the things that we would suggest moving forward is that perhaps using some of these targets as entry points for working on some of the more difficult or more challenging targets that either don't have as much attention, don't have as much data, or are struggling with finance and what have you. So taking some of these targets or taking some of the goals that are a priority and working out from there might be a good way to tackle some of the targets where we're not seeing as much progress. Okay, now part of the reason that this is difficult is, and this is not a surprise to many of us who work on governance issues, which tends to be the area where I focus a lot of my research. Part of the reason this is so challenging is the institutional barriers. So when we talk to policymakers and other stakeholders about why it's difficult to work across some of the different targets, institutions were frequently mentioned. And these institutions also tend to create challenges at different stages of the policymaking process. And so here you can see, for instance, when it comes to the initial sort of agenda setting stages, that you have lack of support coming from different stakeholders. And then when it comes to especially the implementation, we have a strong problem with lack of institutional coordination and coherence, lack of integration, and then lack of finance and data, which are two issues I'll come to next. So this data issue is a related challenge. When we talked about SDG 12, 14, and 15, what we found is that for many of the policymakers, there's still limited data and limited activity even to identify appropriate data. And so this is also reflected in the very beginning of my presentation, where I demonstrated that for 7 out of the 10 targets on SDG 14, we still don't have enough data at the regional level to assess how things are going. And then the financial issues, I think, are compound this problem. And so when we talked about the amount of resources or whether resources had been allocated to implement SDG 12, 14, and 15, only 13% of the interviewees suggested that they'd actually allocated resources for these purposes. And much of the activity that you do get is, for instance, mapping the SDGs with existing plans and to some extent reviewing interlinkages. But when we actually get to the implementation and the allocation of resources, this remains a big problem. And then I'd like to conclude by suggesting that some of the ways to overcome these issues, as I mentioned at the very middle of my presentation, is to take some of the issues where ministries of environment, ministries of finance, and ministries of planning already have some experience, especially experience working together, and using some of that experience to sort of work out to some of the targets where there's less experience. The sort of inside-out approach, I think, has some prospects, but that might not be able to deal with all of the some of institutional data and finance issues, these quote-unquote means of implementation. So here I'd like to conclude by suggesting that I think, of course, COVID-19 has been a tremendous disruption and led to tremendous human suffering and loss. And so I don't want to downplay that by any means. But what I would also suggest, and one of the things that we're trying to highlight in our institute, is that there are certain opportunities that lie in crises. And what we've seen, of course, is this tremendous allocation of resources, public funds in many cases, to deal with the immediate impacts of COVID, and what we would call in our institute the COVID response. And many of these are also targeted at economic recovery, of course. But what we're suggesting is that policymakers need to think about not only the response and the recovery, but also the redesign of different types of systems. And systems here refer to both the sort of infrastructure, the hardware that influences how we deal with environmental issues, as well as some of the institutions. When I think about institutions, here I think there's a lot of scope for building bridges between ministries of environment, ministries of finance, ministries of planning, so that we can work more concretely on some of these issues that are obviously not getting enough attention, such as those covered under SDG 14. And so I would like to suggest that using this RRR framework by linking our response, recovery, and then thinking very systematically about the redesign of our systems and institutions can lead us to a place where hopefully in 5 years or so, if we did this type of presentation, we'd have a much better prognosis on the activity under SDG 14. Thank you very much. That's just an appendix.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. And first and foremost, thank you so much for sticking to the time limit. Highly appreciated. And thank you very much for highlighting this project that was done with the ADB. I think a much needed project, and some of the findings that you have highlighted are actually issues that are faced by other SDGs too, when you analyze them. And not just, of course, every SDG has its peculiarity, but there are, common issues that all of them are facing, and there are common challenges that all of them are facing. But I like the fact that you mentioned that perhaps, the simpler way, if you can call it, is really to not look at all the SDGs at one go, but using some of the SDGs as targets, as entry points, as you said, then to approach the SDGs, which are more difficult to sort of achieve for various reasons. So I think that that's a point very well taken, and it's very important. And secondly, the RRR framework, I find it very interesting, and having worked with IGIS before, I know the kind of groundbreaking work that IGIS keeps doing. So it's good to see that there's this work, there's this new framework which is looking at response recovery and redesigning, and that the policymakers really need to think about redesigning the institutions too. It's important, and the COVID really provides us with an opportunity to do that. So redesigning the systems as well as institutions. So I would just sum it like that. There will be a concluding session later, but I hope I could briefly summarize that now. So thank you very much once again for your really, really interesting presentation. Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you. Thank you very much. So now I would like to move on to our next speaker, who is Ms. Vasita Vijanaike. Vasita works as the executive director of Silken Trust, which is a nonprofit civil society think tank focusing on environmental change, sustainable development, biodiversity and ecosystem conservation, animal welfare, and social justice. Vasita, by profession, is an international lawyer specializing in public international law and has over a decade of experience in working on climate change at national as well as international level. Vasita is also a member of the National Expert Committee on Climate Change Adaptation of the Ministry of Environment of Sri Lanka and is a consultant with the UNFCCC Secretariat and has experience of working with various UN entities and international organizations and networks such as the NAP Global Support Program, the Human Society International, and Southern Voices on Adaptation. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you, Vasita, to this webinar, and we look forward to your presentation. So the floor is now yours. Please go ahead. You have 20 minutes for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm just trying to get the screen sharing working. I hope it works. 1 second.
Yes, we can see your screen, but if you can kindly put it in
Can you see it now?
PowerPoint mode. We can see it, but if you can kindly put it in PowerPoint mode, if possible. If not, then you can kindly just go ahead.
That works.
Perfect, works now. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Right. Okay. I'm a bit new to GoToWebinar, so okay. Do you still see the screen now? I have GoToWebinar again.
It's full screen.
Right,
okay. See. Yes, please go ahead. Thank you.
But unfortunately, I can't say it now. So let me retry this. Give me 30 seconds. I'm sorry.
No problem. Please take your time.
Oh, God. Okay. Let's see this one. Exit.
If this is easier for you, then perhaps.
Okay.
Okay. Yes.
I think it's okay now. Okay. So thank you very much. Thank you, Pooja, and thank you, organizers, for inviting me to speak. It's a great pleasure to speak about some of the work that we're doing at SLIC and Trust, focusing on coastal and marine ecosystems and SDG 14. Just a bit about what we do, what SLIC and Trust is. So we are a nonprofit think tank based in Sri Lanka. We work on climate change, sustainable development, biodiversity and ecosystems, social justice and animal welfare, and we work mostly in Asia and Africa as regional focus, but we also work internationally in the policy process. So some of the work we do focus on evidence-based research, communication outreach, policy analysis, multi-stakeholder engagement, capacity building, and knowledge management. Just to go to what we're focusing on today. So it was great to hear the other two speakers speak, because some of the stuff that were highlighted have a lot of connection to what I wanted to highlight. So I'll skip a few slides because I don't want to repeat what was already mentioned. But as Pooja mentioned in her recap, I suppose, or the summary of what was presented earlier, SDG 14 has a lot of interlinks with other SDGs as well. And some of the ones that relate to our work as key ones would be climate action, addressing poverty and food security, then also communities and settlements, and then how disaster and risk management interlink with SDGs and achieving sustainable development, decent work and economic growth, for example, just transition aspects, livelihood development, and then partnerships for resilience, inclusive and participatory actions, and how gender responsive and consumption. Okay, there is a problem here. It should be responsible consumption and production. So I want to add gender responsive action, and then I ended up adding something else. Sorry about that. So focusing on coastal and marine ecosystem conservation, there are different angles that we can focus on, and then there's actions that can happen in terms of mangrove restoration work that we do, then how waste management could happen. Just to highlight a bit about some of the work we do on mangrove restoration. So this has a couple of benefits because it's not just about SDG 14, but it connects to other SDGs as well. For example, addressing climate change, risk management, as well as economic growth, and how communities could be brought together to manage climate risk as well as disaster risk. And in the activities that we do in Sri Lanka, we have a few sites that we work in, and it's also based on biodiversity conservation as well as ecosystem conservation, and how communities could be brought together to facilitate livelihood development as well. And there are also focuses on gender and youth empowerment, and how they could be champions in ensuring that sustainable development under 14 as well as other SDGs could be achieved. Then there's waste management and pollution control. This is something important under SDG 14 as well. So in the photograph, as you see, it's the community, the fishing community, engaging with us as part of an extra or diversified economic activity for them to collect waste that is there in the ecosystem. And then this then links to a planning process where the local governments and the private sector as well as the communities work together to manage waste in the coastal and marine ecosystems. So there are different dimensions that connect to waste management, and this connects with, for example, how the community during COVID, for example, could earn an extra income, because for us, as Eric highlighted, there was also there's a large impact on what we did because of COVID, and how we had to kind of change the actions that related to SDG 14 to a different process to ensure that the communities engage, to ensure that the ecosystems are protected, and also how economic aspects are addressed. So through the actions related to pollution control, waste management, there was the possibility to build partnerships, for example, with local governments, and then also national and local level relationships, even at the government level, how the national planning processes could connect to the local planning processes, as well as how civil society organizations, private sector, and also communities could work together. Then inclusive and participatory resilience and economic growth. So I believe like whatever we do, sustainable development and finance, as well as actions on climate change, leads to resilience. And it's important that economic growth is part of this, because actions that we do, which are targeting resilience, obviously have to have economic resilience as well as environmental resilience. So in doing this, it's important that these are inclusive, that we engage different communities and different actors, as I explained earlier, as well as decision-making processes, and all the levels of these actions that we implement are participatory. So it's important that there's coordination among different actors, information sharing, and as well as being around and actively engaging in the decision-making processes. So some of the things that we do is, I mean, in any project that we do, is to ensure that the processes and the work that we do, as well as what happens on these topics, could be advocated or ensured to be participatory and inclusive. So this goes across the board in terms of sustainable development actions, as well as climate action, and how adaptation and resilience and co-benefit-based actions could happen. So some of the key words in the work that we do is disaster and climate risk management in SDG 14. Also, this is, I think, a key component, because when we're looking at sea level rise or loss and damage and biodiversity degradation, conservation efforts, and pollution control, and all this, there is a component that relates to risk management. And then how partnerships could be focused, private-public partnerships, public, civil society, and multiple actors, others who engage, how they can be brought together, how the actions could be gender responsive, how can we focus on making sure there is gender balance, gender equity, as well as gender sensitive processes that, I mean, different levels of gender actions, but looking at gender transformative actions would be the objective. And then innovation, research, social protection, looking at the community's livelihoods, and then how in a risk situation, if there's, for example, COVID situation, how can the communities be protected? How can the fishing community be resilient to face this? And then youth empowerment and youth engagement. How can they be leaders? How can they be capacity built to be engaging, helping with ensuring that sustainable development is achieved? How can the ideas and innovations, innovative thoughts and processes that they come up with contribute to achieving SDG 14? So these are some of the things that we focus on as well. So policy interventions is important that we work on the ground and then link evidence-based recommendations to policy interventions, and it could be also contributing to policy interventions that are leading to sustainable development through coordination and institutional mechanisms that are comprehensive and holistically interlinking different actors, different entities that work on SDG 14. So some of the things that we've been looking at, happen again. Right, okay. Right. I can't basically see what's on it, but I'm just going to remember what I'm going to say. So some of the things that we look at in policy process to see how SDGs could connect with the policy processes is, so the work that we do, say for example, in the work that we do in mangrove restoration and waste management in the coastal ecosystem, how can those activities be linked to related policy processes? So it could be coastal policy processes and biodiversity-related sector, or biodiversity sector-related ones, the biodiversity frameworks that are being spoken of at the moment, and how these could be worked in synergy than having actions that are duplicated and work in isolation. And so one of the key things that we focus on in making sure that integration of risk management as well as achieving sustainable development and resilience building across the board connect to NDCs, because we work a lot on climate change, and how the national demand contributions could contribute to achieving sustainable development. And in this sense, for SDG 14, the coastal marine sectors and the NDCs that relate to that, how can they be brought together and complement each other and integrate the actions in such a way that sustainable development is also focused while achieving the commitments under the Paris Agreement. And then national adaptation plans. So for example, Sri Lanka has one. It has a focus on coastal and marine sector. And we work in some countries in Africa and other parts of Asia, where we are developing country profiles. And some of these countries also have a key focus on the oceans and coastal and marine ecosystems and communities. And then also, if you look at NAPS, there's also, if you take the NAPS Central and the resources available, there are some countries or some products that focus on the coastal sector itself as an option to look at national adaptation plans. So tourism, how can tourism also be contributing to these processes? And send a framework for data management for SDGs as well as NDCs. So there's also the need for national and international policy coherence and synergies. I think in the previous presentation, there was a lot of highlight on the data needs, and this is something we always talk about, the need for monitoring and evaluation, the data, the need for mapping risk and the data for it and indicators to be identified, and then across the board, across different processes like SDGs, NDCs, as well as Sendai framework, how can the data be used in such a way that it contributes to ensuring that there's a mechanism to impact assess of the actions and identify the needs and gaps in such a way that we can do effective action. So data management, as I mentioned, that's important, and this could be an entry point for SDG 14 as well as other SDGs. So it's important that we identify the indicators, the data needs, and also how these could be brought in through different processes. So for example, the NDCs would have a monitoring process, and where the countries have coastal marine ecosystems and communities as a focus, the indicators could be complementing each other in terms of the actions of collecting data as well as monitoring and evaluation. So for scaling up action for resilience, so some of the things that are important would be the need for skill and capacity development, and then also how the vulnerable communities and ecosystems are a focus through participatory and inclusive processes and policy interventions that are national and local that interconnect. And it's very important that when we're looking at SDG, as one works together if we want to scale up action. Data management and knowledge sharing, that's important. That helps everyone to scale up action. So access to data, access to information, access and also the availability of impact assessments and lessons learned so that good actions could be replicated and learned from what's needed. And research on this topic is also important. So something Slack and Trust tries to do is have evidence-based actions documented and shared so that it could be replicated or potentially contribute to policy processes. And knowledge management is very important as well. So in the work that we're doing, the communities would like to build their capacities, information to be stored and shared and in different formats. So it could be for policy as well as just for application. So information notes, case studies, and also looking at the UNFCCC process. The Nairobi Work Program works on this. They have Oceans Working Group at the moment, and there's a technical working group on that. And the experts are working on developing products that will help knowledge management. So they had the focal points meeting on the topic of oceans as well. So most of these Nairobi partners have been engaging in the process, but there'll be some knowledge products coming out, and there would be a focus on how certain elements of SDG 14, or maybe all of them, would be focused on in the knowledge products and the knowledge sharing aspects. So Slack and Trust has a knowledge portal that we publish our products on. So it's called the Adaptation and Resilience Knowledge Hub, and you can access it by going to slackandtrust.org. And it's also accessible via the Nairobi Work Program's knowledge portals. So that's it. If anyone has more questions, I'd be very happy to answer. I'm sorry if you didn't see the slides properly, but it was I was struggling a bit with the sharing and all that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vasita. No problems with the presentation. We were able to see it very well. And I think your presentation really followed suit from Eric's. It was a nice blend because Eric talked more about the things happening at the policy and at the international level. So it was good to hear what your organization is doing on the ground, and for highlighting really the importance of having a participatory approach to have different stakeholders involved, even in the decision making, in the action, of course, in the implementation, but also in the decision making process. And also highlighting another important issue, which is really on gender, and why it is really important to also, look at the gender aspect and also the involvement of youth and other local communities to really ensure that we are able to achieve and implement, all the commitments that the different countries have under the various international conventions. So thank you very much, really, for a very interesting presentation. We really, really appreciate that, and thank you for staying on time. I now have the pleasure of inviting our next, final speaker for the webinar in terms of the expert. So may I invite Dr. Lida Pet-Sode. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, Lida. So Lida is a senior strategic conservation and fisheries management professional with practical policy, technical, and management skills. She's a leader in developing new programs, initiating multi-partner platforms, and a strong and effective motivator for the related required organizational change. Lida has extensive experience in developing effective collaborative networks, capable, motivated global teams, and strategic partnerships with various stakeholders, including government, the private sector, academia, and the NGO. And also, she also boasts a proven track record in achieving conservation and natural resource management agendas and supports fisheries improvement programs. Lida is known to her colleagues as a passionate high achiever and a strong team builder. She holds a PhD in fisheries biology and management from the Wageningen Agricultural University in the Netherlands. So, leader, the floor is yours, and please go ahead with your presentation. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my honor and pleasure. It's a remarkable group of experts. So thank you very much. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I wanted to, I think maybe follow up a little bit on the keynote introduction, and then also what Dr. Eric was saying, was sharing with us at the policy level, and our other distinguished speaker, but through telling you a little bit of a story, or a little bit of an evolution, perhaps. Some of that evolution was professional, as you know, I evolved from working on conservation of marine biodiversity towards now being a consultant, partnering a lot with private sector and companies. And perhaps you know, if we look back around this part of the world, we can recognize some of the, you know, maybe we can, some of the points in this evolution where, you know, decades ago, industrialization, you know, was an important agenda of governments in order to, you know, produce food, provide safe places for people to live, and connect increasingly, you know, people across boundaries for purposes of economic growth. Those had impacts, of course, and I think the keynote speaker provided a very good overview of what we are seeing about those impacts in the ocean today. But that even evolved further, where perhaps, you know, through this industrialization over a couple of decades, we now also see automation. We see and we know that I'm not talking about artificial intelligence yet, but you know, a lot of processes can be done faster and easier, and don't necessarily require people to work long hours. And even, you know, in this part of the world, but where I'm from in the Netherlands, people work 3 days, 4 days a week, and have more leisure time, which takes them out. And they realize that some of the impacts of industrialization cause, you know, an experience, perhaps some pollution, you know, not so much nature to walk about, you know, things, you know, infrastructure that obstructs a beautiful view. And you see that over that type of evolution, where perhaps the luxury or the idea of a luxury has changed for some people around us, not everybody, of course, from you know, having a job, having food on the table, to enjoying a leisurely vacation, that the value of you know, the economy and what it gives to us and has perhaps also evolved. Now, what we see today, and I think, again, the examples provided by the keynote speaker are well known to many of us, is a result of the luxury that many people in the world have related to, you know, there's enough to consume. There's perhaps more available to consume than what is needed. And the result of that is waste. And so we have a problem. Now, I thought, and I was very interested, and I'm grateful to be invited, that there's a lot of engineers in this group with us, and following these webinars. And so I know a lot of engineers in my current position. I work with a consulting firm, and engineers like to fix things. So if there's a problem, all you need to do is find a smart engineer and they'll fix it. And thankfully, many problems indeed are fixable mechanically, or through processes that you know, can be to a large extent controlled by people. But when we see what some of the problems are in the ocean, not only because the ocean is so wide, big, and, you know, mysterious, a lot of it, you know, you're just looking at the surface. You know, the problem is not always easy to fix, and I really am also interested and happy to hear that all of the speakers spoke about sanctuaries, the role and the value still of conservation. But following then that part of the evolution, I started as a conservationist, and a lot of my work was not so successful coming at trying to solve the problem in the ocean from that angle. And we need to protect more of the area. We need to fish less. We need to stop doing this. A lot of restrictions. And so I've come through that evolution to a place, and I think that this brings me to the title of this, little contribution, where we now, thankfully and interestingly, are not necessarily just talking about economic development or about conservation, ocean conservation, but we're combining it. And interestingly enough, there's a lot of opportunities that different governments now see in order to both promote economic development. Some countries still, have ambitions and needs to industrialize or, optimize the application of technology for the needs of their society, while also this doesn't necessarily need to go at the cost of a healthy ocean. And obviously, we can, and we're in a very distinguished panel here. We can talk about the definition of blue economy until tomorrow. It's highly interesting to do so. But I just Googled it, and what basically Google tells us is that there are many interpretations, maybe as many as there are, people who work and think about it. But there are a number of words that keep coming back. And obviously, if we try and identify what those are, then perhaps we capture a bit of a concept. I'm not going to go into that now, but you can see that a bank, interestingly, the World Bank, is mostly about money, has words such as sustainable use. But many of the words in the definition by the World Bank are about change. It's about improving, a growing thing, something that gets bigger, or improving livelihoods. Whereas the European Commission basically doesn't give a change when describing their interpretation of the blue economy. And I just Googled what the government in India describes about it. But those are definitions and words, and what do they mean? So I work and have been fortunate to collaborate for many years with government NGOs, also on the ground, on the water, and increasingly with private sector, being part of a environmental engineer company right now. And so the interpretation of that concept in Indonesia then is starting to get real traction. And some of the previous speakers also touch upon this, but some of the progress, I try to capture this in this schematic. So even while there's a lot of words, perhaps you can have a look at what the icons and what the schematics show. So generally, the interpretation of the blue economy concept is, and it touches upon what we heard before, where not only, let's say, the Ministry of the Ocean, to simplify it, takes care of the ocean, but there are partnerships. There is, a government that works as a government for its responsibilities, enabling private sector to be what the private sector needs to be, but taking care of aspects that are, democratic, smart, environmentally sustainable, sort of for the society as a whole. And when we look at where, in this case, for example, Indonesia is, we know that the procedures and the legislation related to investment in infrastructure or in business development evolved over the last 3 decades from being mostly oriented towards do no harm. Yeah, so if you want to build something somewhere, that's necessary because people will benefit from using that infrastructure. But as long as you do no harm, you carry on and you can do that. to a situation, I think starting about perhaps 10 years ago, where aspects of legislative aspects of environmental impact assessment also started to take into account that the social, the human benefits, or in some cases negative impacts of investment and especially related to infrastructure should be considered, while nobody even had thought about climate change aspects of investments. So in the last 10 years, you start seeing that in the legislation and the regulations related to economic development around oceans and coastlines, these concepts of the human aspects and resilience are getting stronger and stronger. And today, in fact, you couldn't find financing if you are not very clear in showing that you've considered, again, the do no harm aspect, but within the context now also of social human, the social and human context. Now, how about we go beyond the do no harm, and even if that is including not only the environmental aspects, but also society and human aspects. But you think about actually your investments, you can be smart in order to do good. And so what would that look like? And this is where the blue economy could go in our view, and where some of the examples that actually previous speakers also brought into this panel fit very neatly. What I now put on the screen is just, again, it's a schematic, and it's not necessarily just a concept. I'm currently working in 3 fishing ports in Indonesia on this eco port approach. It's not a concept. It is something that is quite practical. It requires a lot of engineers, which is nice because, again, they're good in solving problems. But what would it look like, or what does it mean? And again, try and have a look at some of the icons and the drawings on this schematic. But I'll point out perhaps one or two things. Now, plastic and marine debris, as pointed out at the keynote speech, is an increasingly, people are aware that it's an increasingly, hot item, and yet, in order to address waste and manage it, you need smart procedures, you need space where that could be done, and what we are now seeing is that a lot of people don't necessarily want to live near a waste dump. Again, bringing, to as part of this evolution, if people have more leisure, or if they, understand that, it's not healthy to live near a waste dump, obviously they're going to ban it. But in public areas, for example, ports, it could actually be quite possible in order to process your waste and or transport it to places effectively where it could be processed. And so using public space in a smart way, investing and establishing technology that is currently available, and then having smart people to apply that and think about the logistics with the hinterland, with communities, bringing that or benefiting from jobs in order to process that type of waste is a very easy and sort of a practical application of a blue economy concept. Now, that doesn't necessarily do a lot of good yet, right? So that is sort of taking part of a problem away or addressing part of a problem. Supposedly, it's done in a way that it does no further harm. But how can you turn that into something that actually would do some good? So then let me take you to the next and my last schematic. So if you are in a coastal area and you have your port facilities, how could you then move towards a point where not only you're not doing any harm, in fact, you're actually taking some problems away, but furthermore, you're actually contributing and creating something positive, which is ultimately what could be quite possible, and particularly for agencies like the World Bank, a motivation to invest in countries like India and others. So if you're starting to think towards solutions and opportunities to do good with your investments, you could be looking, I don't know, it's like you could be looking at, here. So imagine that at your port facilities and the community who lives around it, there would be, and I don't try to come across as too simplistic here, but there would be great opportunities to, have tourism-related activities, leisure-related activities, if indeed the port facilities and the area around it were clean. And so by applying good practices and taking away problems around public facilities, you could actually provide an opportunity that would do good, and small or medium-sized economic activities could evolve and develop around there. Awareness and learning and innovation could occur around such centers where both technology as well as processes and collaborative processes take place. And then you're starting to get to a situation where, again, the understanding and building the bridges of the needs of a society to indeed provide, in many cases, basic needs, but in some cases also, opportunities for, spiritual development, leisure, other values that the ocean or coastal areas could provide, could go very well hand in hand. I think my last thing before sort of giving it back to our fabulous facilitator is that I've come full circle where today in my work with private sector, governments, communities and finance institutions, I do see that there's a lot of solutions and a lot of things can be fixed. This sort of entrepreneurial engineering approach to solving problems. But I've also realized that and this comes, I think, with a lot of realization of what happened around COVID, that the time that we have, and the scope and the scale at which the problems occur are not matched. The scope and the scale at which problems occur are increasingly overwhelming, and the time that we have to do something about it is short, because there's so many things that we need to do something about. And so that brings me almost full circle again, where I think that indeed the establishments and the support for sanctuaries, marine sanctuaries and marine conservation areas is needed now, perhaps even more than before. But I think that together there are so many smart people with the knowledge and the technology that we can address this in a blue economy approach, quite practically so. I think what it requires is the awareness and the understanding that these things can and should go hand in hand. And therefore, I would really applaud and thank this webinar and the organizers, because that's exactly what you're doing. You are making an important contribution to that awareness and exchange of lessons learned. So thank you so very much.
Well, thank you very much, Lida. For me personally, it was really, really interesting. We, of course, hear about the blue economy, but I think this is really, for me, the first time to really understand what it entails. And it's very important for all stakeholders, not only for those who are like, the investors and are investing, to think about how not to pollute, but actually how to do good. And I think that's applicable in across all the SDGs, and also specifically under SDG 14, because as was already stated at the very beginning in the keynote, that for a country like India too, we have a vast, like our coastline is about 6,000 plus square kilometers. So we have a lot of local communities and who are dependent, their livelihoods are dependent, on the oceans. And it's very, really important to consider all the aspects, think of all the different stakeholders who are involved. And another, the important stakeholders, because we're only talking about people all the time, but really I think all the SDGs, and particularly this one on oceans, really brings forth the importance of considering the marine resources, because we are totally dependent on it. Unfortunately, today's generation, when you ask them, for simple things like where does meat come from, or where does fish come from, or where does milk come from, they just see it at the supermarket and they think that's where it comes from, which is very unfortunate, but it is a reality that we are facing. So, no, thank you very much, really, to also share a practical example of how, in the case of Indonesia, this sort of is being thought of, and perhaps it's, this model is also applicable to other countries, not only in the region but across the globe. But I think there needs to be more awareness on it. I'm not quite sure. This is a question I personally would pose to you in the Q&A, so I would stop there. But I would like to thank you very much, really, for this very, very interesting presentation. And I would like to now thank all the speakers who spoke and open the floor for question and answers. So I will now pass this back on to Mr. Dipesh, who will be posing some of the questions. And as I said, being the moderator, I'll take the liberty of posing a few questions from my side after, during this Q&A session. Mr. Dipesh, please, the floor is yours. Thank you
so much, Dr. Pooja. Actually, surprisingly, due to some technical reason or whatever, we have not received any relevant question from our participants. 2 or 3 questions we have received just related to slideshow, speakers. So I may request you also to request other speakers and other chairmen to post some question and answer session. Because I think Dr. Rakesh Dubey sir is also not available.
Yes, he is also not available.
We can consume that time for some good question and answer session. So I may request you to please.
Okay, being the moderator, this is a first. I never get an opportunity to ask any questions. Usually during these webinars, they're always very intense and we have lots of questions. So I don't know if I should be thankful for the technical glitch so I can ask the questions. But I will start from Lida, if that's okay, and then go to Vasita and then to Eric, if I may ask questions in that. So Lida, you had mentioned, about this, the example of Indonesia where this is being tried. Are there any other countries where such examples can be seen, or, are you communicating this? Like you're working with various institutions, and with the consulting firm must be working with many other countries. So are there examples? What is the 2 questions? One, if there are other countries where, there are examples of this. Secondly, how receptive are governments and the private sector to this concept that you have posed? So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, I think there's many countries who are applying, at different levels, the blue economy concepts. I think that what I tried to sort of illustrate here was, in my understanding, perhaps of interest to engineers. If you're going to make big investments, and that's what this government in Indonesia has done, the maritime fulcrum to connect your islands and to connect people. Then how can you spend that money in a way that it achieves more than just the primary functions of infrastructure? And so I think that was visionary, but it was also economical. And I think there are many countries that perhaps were not needing or not at this stage, investing so much in infrastructure. So I think that the example that I try to give is where you find yourself with a lot of public finance around public space, that you know, the opportunity there are humongous in order to do much more than just, you know, at the end of the day, have your infrastructure. And I think that, you know, Dr. Eric was giving examples, nota bene, of applications of, you know, blue economy concepts at a different scale in Indonesia. And I'm sure in many countries you could find those. I think the second one, how does private sector, you know, and also communities, how do people react to that? I think private sector generally, and here in Indonesia, you know, has been really wait and see. You know, regulations for private sector investment here have gone up and down. Have changed a lot, and private sector typically doesn't like a lot of you know, changes. Yeah, this is the nature of investing in something. Then you need to have it and use it for a while in order to get a return on your investment. And so I see, and unfortunately, that these the public spending, which is huge in Indonesia, and it's remarkable, and I think it's in the right direction, but unfortunately it's not matched yet with private sector funding. What did I say? Public sector funding is big, private sector is small, it's lacking behind. And the risk there is therefore that, you know, you will need to see 5 to 10 years before the benefits of that infrastructure is coming to the economies and the livelihoods of the people. So that is a big challenge here. Yeah. So policy and governance needs to be stable for private sector to follow public sector investment, and there's been a lot of you know, changes here. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, really, because that's very, very important. I'm glad that you talked about it, because we are talking about achieving the SDGs by 2030. This is the decade of the SDGs, as we all know, and we have 9 years to go. And the private sector really is one of the key partners, really, to make the SDGs work. Of course, you have the government, and they are the ones who are making all the commitments at the international level, but the private sector really is a key player. And it's not only SDG 14 is one of the more, I would say, difficult SDGs to work on, not only because of lack of data, finances, as you had all mentioned, but also involving stakeholders other than the governments. You see a lot of action, you see the commitments from the government side, you see a lot of action happening on the ground by NGOs, especially. There's a lot, but then the private sector is really a very, very important component. Unfortunately, you know, we haven't really been able to bring them on board. And with 9 years to go, we have to see how it's going. Eric very nicely presented, you know, specifically under each target, what is really missing. So I think this is something that the government really also needs to work on to bring them on board. So thank you for highlighting that. As you can see, I have lots of questions to ask, but thank you for that, leader.
Hello.
And now, yes, Dipesh, please.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Yeah, actually, right now we have received 2 questions. I think participants are now asking questions. So
Yes,
one question is for Dr. Eric by Mr. Sudhir Kumar. The question is, the climate change and environmental issues are being taken care by environmental acts, their upgradation. Then how come regression effect is seen for SDG 14?
Eric, you got the question?
Yeah. So I'll repeat it just to make sure. So
basically, you had mentioned that, you know, instead of like there's insufficient progress in terms of SDG 14, but not only is it insufficient, there's also some regression. So that's the question of, you know, why there's this regression, and if you could throw some light on that, please. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. So I want to highlight one quick thing as I answer this question. So this is at a regional level that I'm showing this. So each country's situation is different, but at a regional level, we see this regression. And I think what's happening is in the cases where you can actually measure what's going on, and this is sort of very broad, but the pace of economic development is moving faster than the ability to regulate that development. And this is particularly pronounced in developing or LDC context, but I think we see this sort of general trend across the board. And so I think that's, broadly what's driving this. And then I think there's, some question about the ministries of environment are handling these issues. And I would say, yes, that's generally the case, but I think especially on SDG 14, and some of our other panelists might be able to comment even more on this, that some of these issues on SDG 14 don't have, a huge amount of staff that are working on them. And then the staff that are working on them are spread perhaps too thin. So you have, limited amounts of capacity to work on these issues, and economic development in some ways overwhelming that capacity. And I think that type of dynamic is why you see this regression.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Any other questions, Dibeshi? Dipeshi, we can't hear you. You're on mute, maybe.
Thank you. Sorry. Yeah. One more question is a general question by Dr. Prabhudev MSS from MS Government Polytechnic College, Karnataka. He is simply asking, what do you mean by water footprint?
This is to any of the speakers. So if you can...
No, it's not for any specific speaker. Anybody can answer. I think Ms. Vasudha Vijayanaike may answer, because two of our speakers have already take some questions.
Yeah. So Vasudha, somebody wants you to explain in one sentence what a water footprint is.
I'm sorry, I am a lawyer, so I think I'll pass this to the technical experts.
So Eric, Lida, one of you, please, if you can. I can answer it, but please. Eric?
Well, Pooja, to answer it, and of course,
you want me to answer it? Okay.
Yeah. I can do that. I can do that, but better that you do it.
No, please, sir, please go ahead. I've been speaking non-stop, so please.
Actually, how much water is consumed by any industry, and if you divide by the production, say if your steel plant is consuming X amount of water and it's producing so much million tons of steel, you divide by that and you take total water consumption, covering all the units. So you get per ton or the water consumed, that is the water footprint of that. If you are producing generating power, per kilowatt or per megawatt, how much water are you consuming, considering all aspects of the thermal power plant, all units of thermal power plant. That is water total consumption of water footprint. And if you do the auditing of a particular unit or industry, you can try to calculate all the consumption and divide by the unit product units. Then you can get what is the water footprint. Either you take it totality or you take it per unit wise.
Thank you, sir. Explain like an engineer. I would have explained like a soldier. So thank you for that. And if there are no more questions, I'm just going to ask Vasudha.
No, that's all. That's all from the software point of view. Participants have no further questions. I think you may proceed. Right. So
if I may just pose one question to Vasudha and very quickly. Okay, Vasudha, can you explain a little bit about how multiple actors are engaged and how this links to the action on the ground and the policy interventions, specifically related to SDG 14. So if there are any like success cases from the work that you have done or the work being done in Sri Lanka, then that will be highly appreciated. Thank you. Vasudha.
Thank you, Pooja. Thank you. Thanks. So it's interesting that you highlighted how the private sector plays a key role and how it's difficult to engage them. But in Sri Lanka, we have had success in getting them on board, because one of our larger projects is actually funded by the private sector. Mitsubishi Corporation is engaging with us in that. And while they are supporting financially, it's a project that has an MOU with the government entities. So when we started the work, it was obviously difficult, like everything else. But after a few months, we managed to get the government entities in charge of SDG 14, or the key actors working on sustainable development, coastal and marine protection, as well as climate change, to come on board in working with us. And as part of the project, we have a focus on communities. So it's connected to SDGs, NDCs, livelihood development, youth empowerment, and then also research and knowledge management. So the community is part of it. And when you're looking at the levels of government engagement, we have the national level, local governments, as well as a very grassroots level governance system called Praja Mandala. So that is like the village level, like even lower than like what someone would call a village. So it came organically, the structure, because it had a bottom-up as well as top-down approach, depending on the focus of the project. So there were policy interventions that happened at the national level, and then when we're developing the pollution and waste management control, because the two sites we selected were different. One was next to a port, so the economic part comes in again, and that needed the conservation through pollution control and waste management, because there were oil spills and that happened around the area. And the other one was more tourism based, and that was easier to work with restoration efforts. But yeah, for us, it has been actually a success story, and we've learned along the process, because our first site in conserving was like everybody came together and it was one-off. And then we realized it has to be a longer process, working in different communities and different settlements that are like, industrial areas as well as tourism-based areas, and how the communities see things. But for us, it's been a good storyline, a story, a narrative. We've been able to engage everyone. And now with the Global Youth Forum that we're doing, we've been able to engage different youth, not just from Sri Lanka, but different countries, to engage in the process and come up with proposals. So we have some mentors across South Asia who volunteered as well, in addition to from Sri Lanka, and some others from outside entities as well contributing.
Okay. No, thank you so much for that, Vasita. It's good to hear really what is happening in terms of success cases, and thank you very much for that. And I would like to thank all the speakers once again for really, really interesting presentations.
Dr. Pooja.
Yes.
Dr. Rakesh Dubey sir have just joined, so we can go for his address also.
All right. So our keynote speaker, I think now Dr. Dubey is not going to really make a keynote, but I would still, time permitting, would like to invite Dr. Dubey to say a few words and share his view on SDG 14. So Dr. Dubey, the floor is yours. Dr. Dubey?
Mute.
Yeah. Good evening to all of you, and first of all, it's my really apology that that I didn't join in the early hours. This happens in technical things or in the life sometimes. So really, I am expressing my serious and sincere apology to all of you, especially to Institute of Engineers, all dignitaries, and the dignified speakers from various places of the globe, and definitely to the moderator and the audiences. Sir, with due permission of chair, I would like to say few observations which I have my own observations. Number one, this SDG 14, life underwater. When I have gone through it, I found that they are all speaking about the sea or ocean. Am I right?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. So I have certain observations that why don't we consider the inland water bodies which are very, very big, especially in India, I should share, in the central part or in the highland of the part, like Madhya Pradesh, like Uttar Pradesh. You see, there are big, big dams. And if you see, I will like to name few dams like Indra Sagar, like Omkareshwar Dam, like Narmada Sagar, like Gandhi Sagar, like Betwa, you can say this Rajghat. And there are so many things in the north. If we go, then that Nangal dams, and luckily I got some opportunities to visit these dams for some other regions, and I found that they are making lot of economical impact in the society or the country, because in SDG 4 the blue economy they are using the word. So my point is this, that we have to think serious thought, and I request to Institute of Engineers, especially to Saxena sir, who is the chairman of Sustainable Development Goal, that how we should see this part for the inland water bodies. I would like to say, very recently I traveled one dam which is located in Madhya Pradesh, Indra Sagar. It starts in Khandwa and it's end into, sir, in the different part of the Madhya Pradesh, that is Hoshangabad. If I travel on the boat, it took, means boat, not a small boat. It's like a steamer which is carrying almost more than 100 passengers. It took almost 4 hours to travel from one part to another part. Similarly, there are other dams, and if we see, they are having 1,000 tons, or millions of uh, fishing, and then there are, these fishermen, they have their own life. So my request is this to Institute of Engineers, especially Saxena sir, okay, sir, please think it on this direction, and we can give some direction on not only the ocean or the sea life under this water. Why don't we think it on this part? There are a lot of challenges and opportunities for the economic development, for the well-being of the fishermen, or as well as those villages which are waterlogged in such big dams. And suppose something happens wrong in the catchment area or in the downstream, there will be impact on the life of means life under water. If there is no proper fallout from any big dam, the downstream fisheries having some negative impact, not some, but it is a significant impact, and ultimately in the social system, which are those who are living in such type of ecosystem. That is one point of which I thought that I should share with you. And as I said, Saxena sir, if I am late, but I would like to share these points which are very concerned in Indian context especially. I don't know about the other countries' context, but especially in the Indian, and especially in the Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, even this Rajasthan, they are something important. That is one part. I think Saxena sir will definitely look into the concern. And second part, sir, it is a good news to all of you that though I was in a meeting, and this Water and Land Management Institute, that is one of the pioneer institute in the state, uh, Water and Land Management Institute. Such institutes are located in other states also, and these are the vital institute in the states, and they are looking component of SDG 14. Basically, not if we consider with the ocean, definitely not for the ocean, but for the inland water, and they are looking lot of things similarly for the water use and agriculture part. So they have plus point of this our webinar. They said us that why don't we think for the national or international webinar on climate change with the disaster reduction. That's definitely the sustainable development goals will be one part. So on behalf of Institute of Engineers, I have liberty to say that, okay, Institute of Engineers will be part and parcel of this event. And sir, they have appointed me as chief advisor on these parts. So since I am in the steering seat in the institute, so we should convey this our effort for the sustainable development goals, for the wider segment of the society, and slowly we will move across the country. So these are certain my point I thought that I should share with all of you, and really I apology for joining in the late. It is again over to Sakina Saab and moderator Dr. Pooja, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dubey, and we appreciate that you were able to at least make it at the very end of the webinar. We appreciate your effort, and thank you for sharing the good news about this international seminar where we will also be talking about the SDGs. So I hope we are able to actually get many of our speakers who participated in the various SDG webinars perhaps to be part of that international conference. So we will be reaching out to our speakers on that. So Dipesh, may I go ahead and then request for the concluding address? Okay, he's busy. So I would now request Shri Sunil Groverji, who is the chairman of BOG NSDF, to kindly deliver his concluding address. So over to you, please.
Mr. Narendra Singh, President, Institution of Engineers, India, in absentia, Dr. Rakesh Dubey, and the learned speakers we could have today on this webinar, Dr. Eric from Japan, Ms. Ositha from Sri Lanka, and Dr. Lida from Indonesia, and the dear attendees across the globe, and my team of NSDF and from IAI Headquarters Cell Delhi, Engineer Dipesh. Very good evening to all of you. It is my privilege to be present on this webinar on SDG 14. So far, during pandemic times, after learnings that this virtual world need to be disseminated with knowledge, the knowledge need to be shared, the best way is to have a virtual platform. We have been successful that during this pandemic time, we have been able to conduct almost 60 webinars on contemporary issues, out of which 6 have been on these SDGs. And we look at on to these SDGs and try to find out that what is actually desired out of it during the span of 1.5 decades when they were planned and put forth in 2015. Our journey began with 17 goals, out of which first 6 being social, another 7 being economic, and 3 very important being on environment. The goal SDG 13 being climate action. And what it said was, take urgent action to combat climate change and its impact. And then SDG 14, life below water, and SDG 15, life on earth. And when we talk about life below water, water in the shape of oceans, the bodies which Dr. Rakesh Dubey was talking about, the seas, the rivers, who absorb 40% of carbon dioxide, who give employment to almost 200 million people across the globe, and have impact on GDP to the extent of 5%. Now, what as a society available in MERDAP Academy, the Institution of Engineers India, and in the personalities like Dr. Eric, Ms. Vosetha, Dr. Leda, that what really we can contribute. As rightly pointed out by Dr. Eric, that everybody is well aware that what is the ultimate goal out of these SDGs. Everybody wishes to stay on this planet, which we want to make it as a healthy planet and healthy life, for which two major ingredients, that is clean air and clean water with clean environment, is the basic necessities. Now, while I was just traversing back on the memories, and we were celebrating World Environmental Day on 2019, we came with a theme, how to beat the plastic pollution. And today we were talking about the life below water. Now, how this plastic is taking away these lives and polluting the oceans, I think much was said in 2019 that we are going to have a behavioral change in our day-to-day life, and we are not going to use the one-time plastic. Whether at that point in time, which was put forth, that 13 million tons of plastic leak into the sea, ocean each year, maybe data will tell in times to come whether this 13 million tons have gone down to 10 million tons or gone up to 15 million tons. There has been no analysis. It was told at that point in time that about 1 lakh million species below water die every year. Data analytics will tell that whether these populations are on having more death rate than it was envisaged in 2018. To my mind, three major things are required. One, that somebody need to make an analysis that what was desired to be in the SDGs goals in 2016 nation-wise, maybe Indian government is trying to have a directorate in Niti Aayog to take care of SDG 16 goals, target their achievements and how to go further on it. Some agency of a kind, the academy which Dr. Rakesh Dubey is handling with other like-minded people associated with it, to come with facts that where really we have achieved and how really we have to work forward to make a behavioral change in us, so that under these SDG goals, particularly related to environment, are taken care of. I am going to show you a small film of 2 to 3 minutes where you will see how the life below earth is getting, extincted every day in, and you will go through this film, you will find that it says at one place then 1/4 of the fish at this point in time which we eat is a plastic. Something really need to ponder over, and then to be very frank and honest, there has been practically no change in my behavioral way of doing things until or unless I was forced, like in COVID-19 time, I was asked to have an appropriate COVID-19 behavior, meaning thereby that I cannot get out of my house if I don't have this very mask put on my face. So now there is need to, even at this point in time, knowing well that if I get COVID-19 I'll die, still the governments are being asked to put people on road to challan the people who are not using this very masks on there. So for this environmental issue, probably there need to be a behavioral change, and we have to have an appropriate, SDG goals. I would say it is, appropriate SDG 17 achieving behavior. We need to really, because when we were talking about that SDG last week, and Dr. Pooja was telling about that water thing, and water day was coming. So we had a water day on World Water Day on 22nd of this month. There I said that we should conserve water, we should not pollute water, we should not waste water, and we should have a appropriate water use behavior. And I think for this very thing, the second one, I told you about this behavior, and third thing, which Dr. Rakesh Dubey has been telling almost in all the webinars we attended with him, that there need to be a cohesive approach which should have our synergies going in that direction, that we act together. And that is what practically Dr. Eric was telling when he was talking about that response, recovery and redesign. Basically, he was telling that there is a high level of awareness, but there is high degree of deficiency, and we are not efficient enough to reach to a level where we are desired to go. And we should really look at our targets and define them in that manner, that what really we can achieve. We should work together and we should achieve that. Maybe leaving aside the other targets, what are the very important targets, we should go about that. And that very message which Vasitha has told was that everyone have to act together. She told about that coastal and marine ecosystem conservation, the waste pollution control, but ultimately the goal, which is sustainable, resilient and inclusive world, is well spelled out by Dr. Eric and Vasitha, coupled with what importantly Dr. Lida had told, that this blue economy, the people, the 3 billion people who are living in the coastal areas, can really work on this blue economy model and make this as a avenue for not only their earnings, but simultaneously saving the marine life, the oceans, which are very important. So now I will just take you to that small film of 2 minutes and then conclude by saying that it has been a wonderful learnings for us at National Skill Development Forum at Shimla, an independent forum of Institution of Engineers India, who has taken the mandate of Institution of Engineers India of knowledge dissemination, knowledge awareness through its virtual platform. And all these webinars are now being assimilated as a compendium And I will request Dr. Pooja, as and when this compendium is ready, that she can run through that and pick up a few learnings out of these webinars which we could have and place it at an international webinar or symposium whenever we have in a shape of a short film. So that these learnings are don't go waste, and ultimately we are going to change and have a behavioral change as a I told you, as a appropriate SDG 17 achieving behavior across the society, so that everybody participate as their mission to stay on this healthy planet healthily. Thank you very much. Now I'll take you to that film. Please see it for 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
चलो नहीं है
Our oceans sustain life. An abundant ocean can
नहीं
Our oceans sustain life. An abundant ocean can feed 1 billion people a healthy meal every day forever. But now they are being killed by throwaway plastics. The equivalent of 1 garbage truck of plastic is dumped in the sea every minute. 17.6 billion pounds every year. Plastic is everywhere in our ocean, floating on the surface, mixing in the salt water, and sitting on the ocean bottom, miles and miles deep. And once in the ocean, it never goes away. Over hundreds of years, it breaks down into small pieces. But those pieces, even the tiny ones called microplastics, are still plastic. Sea turtles are choking on it. Scientists say that over 60% of whale and dolphin species are affected by it. Zooplankton, the base of the ocean food chain, eat it. And so do we. It's in the water we drink. It's in our food. Microplastics have been found in our salt, our honey, and our beer. And sometimes even in the air we breathe. Companies are choosing to make something that will be used just once, from a material that lasts forever. If you don't like what throwaway plastics are already doing to our world, brace yourself. We face a tsunami of throwaway plastic in our and the ocean's future. 4 times more plastic will be produced between now and the middle of the century than has been produced in all of history. 4 times more. What can we do? Recycling? Of all the plastic ever generated as of 2015, only 9% was recycled. Even when it is recycled, plastic degrades. Your plastic soda bottle maybe becomes a shampoo bottle, then a floor mat. Even in the best case, it doesn't recycle, it downcycles. And then it becomes pollution that ruins our beaches and chokes sea animals forever. We should not be forced to pollute the ocean every time we eat, drink, or go shopping. We need to be given a choice, a plastic-free choice. Schools and workplaces establish zones that are free of throwaway plastic. Let's stop plastic pollution from wrecking our beaches and our oceans, and have healthy oceans that delight and sustain us for generations to come.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you very much.
very much. Thank you very much. So last but not the least, may I request Mr. Dipesh to perhaps deliver the vote of thanks on behalf
Thank
of
you.
the...
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
बस इसको बढ़ाना
It is indeed a privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. I, on behalf of the Institution of Engineers India Sustainable Development Forum and ERDMP Academy, and also on my own behalf, extend a very heartfelt gratitude to all the participants and distinguished speakers for gracing this webinar and sharing with us their valuable views and opinion today. Due to some unavoidable circumstances, Engineer Narendra Singh, President Institution of Engineers India, could not make it convenient to join with us, but we would like to express our sincere gratitude to the President Institution of Engineers for being a source of inspiration for us for organizing the webinar. We are equally thankful to Engineer Ashwani Kumar Saxena, Chairman, Sustainable Development Forum, and Engineer Sunil Grover, Chairman, BOG NSDF, for gracing the webinar with their valuable addresses. We are also grateful to our distinguished eminent speakers, Dr. Rakesh Dubey, Dr. Eric Justman, Dr. Lida Pet Soide, Ms. Bosta Vijayanaike. I'm confident that the participants would have been enriched by their valuable views and opinion by their addresses. Our thanks to Dr. Pooja Sane for moderating the sessions of the webinar in such a befitted manner. I also take this opportunity to express our sincere thanks to Dr. H.R.P. Yadav, Secretary and Director General, Institution of Engineers, guided us from time to time for organizing the webinar. Unfortunately, he could not make convenient to join due to some sudden unavoidable engagements. I also express sincere webinar. We thank you all for being with us. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you. Jai Hind.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. This is the end of the webinar, and we hope to see many of you in the next webinar next month. So thank you.